I'm sure most of you by now are familiar with the term better off blue. And if you're not, I'll explain it briefly. Better off blue implies that, for better or worse, there are certain individuals, specifically men, who are better off just not knowing all the stuff that they could know when it comes to gender relations, and more broadly, about the world itself. So the idea is very simple. Given their mentality, given their psychology, if these people were exposed to certain ideas, it would potentially lead them to their ruination. And given that potentiality, you want to avoid that outcome rather strenuously. Now, I think there's a lot of merit to this. Everyone is individually different, everyone possesses different psychology, and different people interact with different ideas. I've talked to people that are very, very resilient, if you will, for lack of a better term, when it comes to encountering some of the harshest, most depressing ideas out there. And I mean by that, of course, ideas that map onto reality that are nigh irrefutable, and it doesn't seem to affect them in the slightest. I also know people, and they're frequently the same people, who are perhaps not immune to depression, but highly, highly resistant to depression. So psychological obstacles, physical obstacles, nothing really gets them down. Or if it does, it's very, very brief, and they're able to shrug it off almost instantly. And so a set of ideas, no matter how true they might be or depressing they might be, isn't really going to affect them too adversely. So you have those people. And on the other side of the coin, or to the far left of the bell curve, you have people that are extremely labile, that are very, very susceptible to the slightest change in perception and the slightest bit of interference from the world. These are the people that are highly neurotic, for example. Unfortunately, although I'm not completely there, I've been saddled with a psychology that is much closer to the neurotic extreme than the ultra-resilient extreme. So I'm speaking, at least in part, from some experience here. As we all know, your personality has a huge genetic component. You do not sculpt it. So if you happen to be neurotic, then you were neurotic, and that's the end of the story. Full stop. And you have people who are just in the middle. And that's the thing. When you encounter someone, you just don't know how they're going to be, especially if you're not friends with them. And the question that has been revolving around my head for a while, for a number of years now, in particular, is how you interact with younger people, and specifically younger men. Because with older men, it usually is just a question of time. Now, don't get me wrong. There are, quote-unquote, very blue-pilled men out there that still walk the so-called thin blue line, as the title implies, who never lose that quality. And in some sense, for lack of a better way of describing it, they have their own resilience. They just keep on believing in, well, what's effectively BS, time after time, no matter what. Some of the prototypical examples of this are guys that get married 5, 6, 7 times, and they never think about the prospect of it just not working out, despite repeated failures. They either don't see the pattern, or they don't care about the pattern, or whatever it might be. And so they just go through it again and again and again. Or there might be other guys, very, you could say, fortunate individuals, who find the equivalent of unicorns, or the approximation thereof, and they just exist throughout their lives for decades and decades in a blissful state of ignorance because, for whatever reason, the harsh reality that tends to affect most of us never affects them and never will affect them. But those are extreme cases, obviously. Most people, most men, over time, become aware of certain realities, and it's almost impossible not to develop just a little bit of cynicism when it comes to these things. Well, fair enough. And in that sense, you could say, well, if life is going to do the so-called blackpilling, you might as well just let it happen, let it run its course. People will come to certain conclusions on their own, and there's no need for you to speed up the process. And I technically would be in large agreement with that, but on the other hand, you have this conundrum. It's a real conundrum, it really is. And that is, when you're a young guy in particular, you're typically the most ignorant about all these phenomena because A, you don't have enough life experience, B, you have not acquired the knowledge, and knowledge oftentimes is precipitated by exposure and experience. So the reason why you want to find something out is because you've gone through something. So for example, if you have a certain illness, you want to learn more about that illness so you can either deal with it better, cope better, whatever it might be. Same thing here. And so failure often leads to seeking out that knowledge. I've talked about this before. And that's especially true in the mating game. So you have this situation, this conundrum with young guys who, many of them are quote-unquote blue-pilled, who are unaware of all this stuff. And then you have to ask the question as to whether or not it's a good idea to inform them. Now, there are some people, especially in the manosphere, unfortunately, who are quite the zealots. And I'm personally not a fan of zealotry, if I'm perfectly honest. I think that these are things that are nuanced, and the question in particular is nuanced, and you really have to kind of weigh all the options here. This is not a black or white thing. That's the whole point of Better Off Blue. Discerning how you walk that thin blue line is down to you and the individual you're interacting with. I don't think you can offer some kind of axiomatic dictate that states something like all men must be red-pilled or black-pilled, or take your pick of whatever pill you want to choose there, because it just doesn't apply. There's no one shoe size fits all, and there never was, and there never will be. There are so many zealots out there online, and also a lot of, to be honest, grifters and hucksters, and just people who are just putting out information willy-nilly, that given the access to the internet, given all these things, young guys are inevitably going to stumble upon this stuff regardless. And that's where it becomes really tricky, because if left to their own devices, especially if they're teens or in their early 20s, not fully developed, they're not fully mature, they can only process these ideas up into a point. And all of us remember what it was like to be 17, 18, 19, even 20, when you really thought you had everything figured out, right? You had figured everything out, you got it, you understood everything. At least that's what you thought. And I'm not even talking about understanding gender relations here. I'm talking about broadly about the world. And of course, you get older and you realize you were a fool. The problem is, almost all of us go through that phase. And that phase becomes all the more deadly, if you think about it, when, frankly speaking, you're dealing with this type of information and the so-called black pill. You see this manifest itself these days in various ways, doom posting, things of that nature. And sometimes I just have to ask the question whether or not it's a good idea for super young people to become obsessed with these ideas. And this is where I think the intervention is potentially important, because if left to their own devices, they're getting this information unfiltered, and the lack of filter is actually not helping. So here's what I think. In the cases where young men have already begun to expose themselves to certain types of these ideas, and they've sort of run away with it, then I think some course correction is in order. Because again, speaking of zealotry, there's no one more zealous than a young person with a particular ideology or set of beliefs that is unwilling to test those beliefs against reality, and also in part due to the lack of experience cannot do that. They cannot test these beliefs in accordance with the reality. Which is not to say that these ideas are incorrect. I freely admit I'm pretty black-pilled because I think the black pill corresponds largely to human existence. However, I just think that there is nuance there, and the filter or the lack thereof that currently exists and the pipeline that reaches young men is not great. And so if you're 17, 18, and 19 and you've completely succumbed to doomerism, then you might say it's partially justified. It really depends on your life circumstances, which is yet another factor you have to take into account. But again, there's nuance in these things. And I just generally think, as a policy, as a rule of thumb, that young guys should not be giving up full stop. So, depending on your circumstances, in terms of looks, in terms of intelligence, in terms of personality, in terms of your prospects, which means what cards have the gods dealt to you, then some of these reactions might in fact be appropriate, but in many cases, they're not appropriate yet, or you haven't properly lived your life. And that's the whole point, right? So walking that thin blue line entails knowing when to interact with someone, when to not. And again, the conclusion I've come to is, broadly speaking, a lot of these guys are going to get the black pill information regardless. And as a consequence, when they bring it up at least, it's important there to intervene and talk about nuance, right? Now, again, when you're talking to young people, you're always going to run up against the wall of know-it-allism and just overconfidence. It's normal because young people always know everything better. And it can even happen when you're older. But with young people, it tends to be a lot worse, the know-it-allism and always knowing everything better. But I just don't see a way out here. As for the people who just avoid or just never encounter the doom posting or the black pill, they may or may not actually end up encountering it. Like I said, there are people I know in their 80s and their 70s, I've even met people in their 90s, who are as blue-pilled as you can imagine, have never imbibed a single black pill, despite being, at least in theory, exposed to things that potentially could have led to that outcome. So where I've arrived at is basically the general tendency these days is for young men to be aware of this information, but they need a filter. They need guys with experience who can at least break things down in a way that's not totally alien from reality. Because in general, the information they're getting is largely true and contains lots of kernels of truth, but there's going to be nuance there. There are things you have to take into account. And again, as I've said, I've encountered people who never encounter or cross paths with any of this stuff, no matter what adversity or struggles they encounter. So it's going to come down to a lot of context. And I think, in general, this is one of the great flaws of the manosphere in its modern 2025 manifestation. It's all tailored to massification. It's all tailored, unfortunately, to mainstreamification. And when everything is being so perniciously massified, there's no way to look at individual situations. And that's how you end up in the situation where better off blue is sometimes okay, but in some cases it's not, and you just don't know. And I don't know how we can change this when it comes to the manosphere and the information within the manosphere, but that's kind of where we're at in 2025. And if history is any teacher here, I reckon it's very likely to continue this way or get even worse. But in any event, as always, thank you for tuning in. And a special thanks to my very generous patrons on Patreon, my generous donors on PayPal. You guys are the best. Without you, this channel could not exist. Thank you so much, as always. And if you can engage in the usual YouTube channels of liking the video, sharing the video, even a comment, subbing. If you're not yet a subscriber, much appreciated. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Take care for now.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.